Imagine coming home after a long, exhausting week, ready to kick back with a cold beer and enjoy the peaceful view of your Texas field. And instead, you're greeted by a towering monstrosity that looks like it belongs in a dystopian nightmare. That's exactly what happened to me, Jack Wilson. 1 minute, I'm pulling into my driveway, humming along to Johnny Cash, and the next, I'm staring at a giant cell tower planted dead center in my property. No warning, no permission, just there, blinking its obnoxious little lights like it owned the place. I slammed my truck door shut so hard I'm pretty sure I dented it and marched straight onto the field, hoping, praying, that this was some kind of prank. Maybe my buddies had finally gone too far with their April Fool's jokes. But as I got closer, it hit me. This wasn't a joke. This was real. A 200-foot tall metal monstrosity had sprouted on my land like an alien invasion while I was gone. And let me tell you, folks, nothing prepares you for the sheer absurdity of seeing something like that where your hay bales used to sit. My first thought was that maybe I'd missed some kind of notice or warning from the city. Surely someone had to tell me they were planning to build this thing, right? So I sprinted over to my mailbox like a man possessed, hoping to find answers. What did I find? Nothing. Nada. Just my electric bill and a coupon for 10% off at Home Depot. Not exactly helpful when you're dealing with a surprise cell tower on your property. At this point, I was fuming. Who in their right mind builds something this massive on someone else's land without asking? It wasn't like they put up a swing set or planted some flowers. This was industrial-grade infrastructure. So I did what any rational person would do. I started making calls. First to the city, then to the county, then to every telecom company I could think of. After spending hours on hold listening to elevator music and being transferred between departments that clearly didn't care about my problem, I finally got an answer. The HOA was responsible. Yes, the HOA, the Homeowners Association, those self-appointed overlords who think they run the neighborhood but can't even manage their own paperwork properly. Turns out, they'd signed some kind of deal with a telecom company to build the tower on what they called common land. Except, and here's where things get juicy, that common land wasn't common at all. It was my land, legally owned by yours truly, Jack Wilson. Now let me pause here for a second because if you've ever dealt with an HOA before, you already know how ridiculous this is about to get. HOAs are notorious for being sticklers about rules. Rules for how tall your grass can be, rules for what color you can paint your house. But apparently when it comes to following rules themselves, forget it. So armed with this information that my field had been hijacked by the HOA, I decided it was time for some answers. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Tuesday night at the community center. A building that smells faintly of mildew and broken dreams. And you better believe I showed up ready for battle. The room was packed with retirees arguing about whether our neighborhood Christmas decorations were too tacky. But I wasn't there for small talk. When it was finally my turn to speak, I stood up and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Excuse me, but can someone explain why there's a cell tower on my property?" The room went dead silent. Well, as silent as it could get with someone crunching pretzels in the back corner. And then Karen, yes, her name was Karen, the HOA president, cleared her throat and said in her best condescending tone, "Mr. Wilson, that land is part of the neighborhood's shared space." Shared space? Oh no, no, no. This wasn't some communal picnic area or dog park. This was my field. The one I paid taxes on every year and mowed every summer while sweating buckets under the blazing Texas sun. I pulled out my deed right there in front of everyone like it was an ace card in poker night and said, "Actually, Karen, this document says otherwise." She squinted at it like she'd never seen legal paperwork before, which honestly wouldn't surprise me, and mumbled something about miscommunication. Miscommunication? Lady, you built an entire cell tower without asking permission. That's not miscommunication. That's trespassing. At this point, everyone in the room started whispering like we were in high school and someone had just spilled tea about prom drama. Karen tried to regain control by saying they'd look into it. But I wasn't buying it, not for 1 second. I left that meeting feeling more determined than ever to get justice, or at least make their lives miserable enough to regret messing with me. And just like that, Operation Tower Takeover began. After that chaotic HOA meeting where Karen tried to gaslight me into thinking my own land wasn't mine, I knew I needed to dig deeper. If these people were going to play dirty, I was ready to roll up my sleeves and jump into the mud. And let me tell you, nothing motivates a man quite like having his property rights trampled on by a group of clipboard-wielding busybodies. I went home that night, poured myself a stiff drink, and pulled out every document I had related to my property. Deeds, tax receipts, survey maps, you name it, I had it spread out on my kitchen table like I was about to solve a murder mystery. And guess what? Every single piece of paper confirmed what I already knew. The land was mine. Not common land, not shared space, just plain old Jack Wilson's field. But here's the thing about HOAs. They love to hide behind their governing documents. You know, those endless pages of legalese called the CC and RS, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, that no one actually reads when they buy a house because they're too busy imagining where their couch will go. Well, not this time. I was determined to read every word of that HOA handbook if it killed me. Now, if you've never had the pleasure of reading HOA CC and RS, let me paint you a picture. It's like trying to decode ancient hieroglyphics written by a lawyer who hates joy. There were rules about everything. How tall your grass could be, what color your shutters had to match, spoiler, beige. Even how long you could leave your trash cans at the curb before incurring a fine. But nowhere did it say they had the right to build a cell tower on private property without permission. Feeling smug with this newfound knowledge, I decided it was time to get some professional backup. That's when Ted entered the picture. Ted was a real estate lawyer recommended by a friend of mine who'd once sued his HOA over some nonsense about bird feeders. Long story, Ted looked like he'd been living off coffee and stress for the past decade. But the man knew his stuff. After hearing my story, he leaned back in his chair, smirked and said, "Jack, this is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard, and I deal with HOAs for a living." Ted explained that while HOAs do have certain powers, like enforcing rules about lawn maintenance or parking violations, they can't just go around violating property laws because they feel like it. He even quoted some legal precedent about how HOAs are bound by their own governing documents and state laws. Basically, Karen and her cronies were way out of their depth here. So we got to work. Ted helped me draft a formal letter demanding that the HOA provide all documentation related to their decision to build the tower. Meeting minutes, contracts with the telecom company, permits, everything. We sent it certified mail because nothing says, business, like making someone sign for your angry letter at the post office. A week later, I got their response, or rather, lack of one. Instead of providing the documents we requested, they sent back a generic letter full of legal mumbo-jumbo about how they were reviewing the matter. Reviewing what? The fact that they got caught with their hands in the cookie jar? At this point, Ted suggested we escalate things by filing an official complaint with the county zoning board. Turns out, building a cell tower isn't as simple as sticking some metal poles in the ground and calling it a day. There are permits involved, permits that require approval from both the property owner, that's me, and local authorities. And wouldn't you know it, the HOA hadn't bothered to get either one. Armed with this information, we filed our complaint and waited for the county to do its thing. Meanwhile, I decided to have a little fun at Karen's expense because if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that petty revenge is highly underrated. First, I put up a giant sign at the edge of my field that read, "Welcome to Karen's Tower of Shame, brought to you by your friendly neighborhood HOA." It wasn't exactly subtle, but then again neither was building a cell tower without permission. The sign quickly became a local attraction. People were stopping by to take selfies with it like it was some kind of roadside landmark. Next, I started digging into Karen herself. Not literally, though I wouldn't have minded burying her in paperwork. With a little help from Google and some nosy neighbors who couldn't stand her either, I discovered she'd been fined by her own HOA last year for having an unapproved mailbox design. Oh, the irony. Apparently she'd replaced her standard-issue beige mailbox with one that had tiny flowers painted on it. A clear violation of Rule 17b or whatever nonsense they'd come up with that week. I made sure everyone in town knew about Karen's rebellious mailbox past because if she was going to play dirty politics with my land, then fair was fair. But don't worry, I wasn't just sitting around being petty while Ted handled all the serious stuff behind the scenes. No, sir. I also started attending every single HOA meeting armed with questions designed to make them squirm. Can you explain why there are no records of homeowner approval for this project? Who signed off on spending HOA funds without proper authorization? Karen, how much did you personally profit from this deal? Okay, maybe that last one was more speculation than fact. But hey, she deserved it. By now, tensions were running high in our little community. Half the neighborhood was on my side because they hated Karen almost as much as I did. The other half just wanted me to shut up so they could go back to arguing about Christmas lights and lawn ornaments in peace. But there was no turning back now. Not until justice was served or Karen resigned in disgrace, preferably both. And so we waited for the county's investigation results, for Ted's next legal move, for Karen's inevitable meltdown when she realized she'd finally met her match in Jack Wilson, defender of property rights and king of petty revenge. After weeks of back-and-forth nonsense with Karen and her HOA cronies, I finally got my hands on their so-called documentation about the cell tower. And let me tell you, calling it documentation is generous. It was more like a collection of poorly written meeting notes and half-baked excuses. First off, they claimed the tower was built to enhance community connectivity. Connectivity? For who? The squirrels? Because I sure didn't ask for better cell service while standing in my own field. Then they tried to argue that the tower was strategically placed on common land to benefit everyone. Common land. There it was again, their favorite phrase. But here's the kicker. When I looked at their maps, the common land they were referring to didn't even exist. They'd literally drawn a dotted line through my property and labeled it shared space. I don't know if they thought I wouldn't notice or if they genuinely believed they could just invent new boundaries like they were playing Monopoly. Now, I'm no legal expert, that's why I hired Ted. But even I knew this was a disaster waiting to happen for them. Ted took one look at their paperwork and said, "Jack, this is amateur hour. They're making it up as they go." And he wasn't wrong. Their maps didn't match the county records. Their permits were incomplete. And their contract with the telecom company was full of vague language that basically boiled down to, "We'll figure it out later." So naturally, Ted suggested we hit them where it hurts. Their wallets. He drafted a demand letter so scathing it could have doubled as a roast at a comedy club. In it, we laid out every single way they'd violated property laws, zoning regulations, and basic human decency. We demanded immediate removal of the tower or compensation for damages. Because let's be real, that thing wasn't coming down without a fight. We sent the letter via certified mail because nothing says we're serious, like making someone sign for their impending doom at the post office. And then we waited. Days turned into weeks with no response from Karen or her HOA henchmen. At first, I thought maybe they were scrambling to come up with an excuse or better yet, an apology, but nope. When their reply finally arrived, it was just more of the same nonsense. Vague promises to review the matter and thinly veiled threats about how litigation would be costly for all parties involved. Costly? Oh honey, you don't scare me with lawyer talk. I've already got Ted on speed dial and enough righteous anger to fuel me through 1,000 court battles. If anything, their weak response just made me more determined to see this through. That's when Ted suggested we file an official complaint with the county zoning board. Now, if you've never dealt with zoning boards before, let me tell you, they're not exactly speedy operators. Bureaucracy moves slower than a snail stuck in molasses, but when it does move, it hits like a freight train. We submitted our complaint along with all the evidence we'd gathered. Deeds, maps, surveys, everything that proved the HOA had no right to build on my land. And while we waited for the county's investigation to unfold, I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands. Figuratively speaking, of course. You see, Karen and her crew had underestimated just how petty I could be when provoked. First up, public humiliation. I printed out copies of their ridiculous maps, the ones with imaginary dotted lines, and handed them out at every HOA meeting like party favors. "Here's your proof," I said with a grin as Karen tried, and failed, to keep her composure in front of an increasingly skeptical audience. People were laughing so hard you'd think I'd brought stand-up comedy to the community center instead of legal evidence. Next came my piece de resistance, social media warfare. I started posting updates about the situation on our neighborhood Facebook group, a platform Karen had previously used to shame people for leaving their trash cans out too long. Oh, how the tables had turned. My posts quickly gained traction as neighbors chimed in with their own HOA horror stories. Everything from fines for having unapproved garden gnomes to disputes over mailbox designs. Apparently beige isn't everyone's favorite color. But here's where things got interesting. One neighbor mentioned that Karen had been pushing for higher HOA dues recently, supposedly to cover community improvements. Improvements like what? A cell tower? Suddenly people were connecting dots faster than a conspiracy theorist with a corkboard and red string. Meanwhile, Ted was busy doing what he does best, building our case into an unstoppable legal juggernaut. He found precedent in similar cases where HOAs had overstepped their bounds and been forced to pay hefty fines, or worse, dissolve entirely due to financial mismanagement. He even discovered that Karen might have violated her fiduciary duty as HOA president by signing off on deals without proper homeowner approval. A big no-no in legal circles. By the time the county zoning board finally issued its ruling, which confirmed that the HOA had indeed violated zoning laws, we were ready to strike while the iron was hot. Ted filed a lawsuit demanding compensation for damages and legal fees along with immediate removal of the tower, or payment of rent directly to me if they wanted it to stay up. And let me tell you, the moment Karen received those court papers was priceless. She showed up at the next HOA meeting looking like she'd seen a ghost while trying, and failing, to spin this whole mess as some kind of misunderstanding. Misunderstanding, I said loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. Karen, you built a cell tower on my land without asking permission. That's not a misunderstanding. That's theft. The crowd erupted into applause because by now most people had turned against her anyway, especially after learning how much money she'd wasted trying to cover her tracks instead of admitting fault from day one. And so began what can only be described as Karen's downfall, a slow-motion train wreck that left her reputation in tatters and her HOA cronies scrambling for damage control. But hey, I wasn't done yet. Alright, so there I was, sitting at my kitchen table with Ted, my lawyer, and a celebratory pizza. Why the celebration? Because the county zoning board had officially ruled in my favor. That's right, Karen and her HOA minions were officially on the losing side of this battle. But let me tell you something about people like Karen. They don't go down without a fight. Oh no, they dig their heels in, double down on their bad decisions, and somehow manage to make things even worse for themselves. A few days after the ruling, I got a letter from the HOA. And when I say letter, I mean a 6-page manifesto typed in Comic Sans, because of course it was, that essentially said, "We're not taking down the tower, and there's nothing you can do about it." They claimed that removing the tower would be financially devastating for the HOA, and that it was in the best interest of the community to keep it up. Best interest of the community? What community? Nobody asked me, or any of my neighbors for that matter, if we wanted a giant blinking monstrosity ruining our view. Ted read the letter, then looked at me with this gleam in his eye like a kid who just found out Christmas was coming early. "Jack," he said, "they've just handed us a golden opportunity. Turns out, by refusing to comply with the zoning board's ruling, the HOA was now in violation of not just property laws but also county regulations. And you know what that meant? Fines. Big ones. So Ted filed another motion with the court to enforce the zoning board's decision and impose penalties on the HOA for every day they refused to take down the tower. And while we waited for our court date, I decided to turn up the heat on Karen and her crew in my own special way. First, I rented one of those portable light-up signs, the kind you see outside car dealerships advertising sales, and parked it right at the edge of my property where everyone driving into the neighborhood could see it. The sign read, "HOA funds at work. Enjoy the view of my illegal cell tower." It was petty, sure, but oh so satisfying. Next, I started digging into how much money the HOA was actually making from this tower deal. With a little help from Ted and some public records requests, I found out that Karen had negotiated a sweet little contract with the telecom company that paid the HOA thousands of dollars every month in rent. Thousands! And yet here she was crying poor about how they couldn't afford to take it down? Give me a break. Naturally, I shared this information with my neighbors, because if there's one thing people love more than gossip, it's finding out their HOA is hoarding money while still charging them outrageous dues for things like landscaping improvements, which apparently meant planting 3 sad-looking bushes near the entrance sign. The neighborhood was buzzing with outrage. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just an overbearing HOA president. She was public enemy number 1. And then came court day, the moment I'd been waiting for ever since this whole mess started. Ted and I walked into that courtroom armed with more evidence than an episode of Law and Order. We had deeds, maps, zoning board rulings, you name it. Karen showed up looking like she hadn't slept in weeks, probably because she hadn't, clutching a binder full of what I assume were excuses and half-baked justifications for her actions. The judge didn't waste any time cutting through their nonsense. He asked Karen point-blank why they hadn't complied with the zoning board's ruling, and her response was, well, let's just say it wasn't great. She started rambling about how removing the tower would be logistically challenging and how it provided valuable services to the community. The judge raised an eyebrow and said something along the lines of, valuable services don't override property rights. Boom. By the end of the hearing, it was clear which way things were going. The judge ruled in my favor again, this time ordering not only that the tower be removed, but also that the HOA pay me compensation for damages and cover my legal fees. Oh, and those fines Ted mentioned? Yeah, those were piling up to hundreds of dollars for every day they kept stalling. Now you'd think this would be enough to make Karen throw in the towel, right? Wrong. Instead of admitting defeat gracefully, or at least quietly, she decided to hold an emergency HOA meeting to try and rally support from other homeowners. She framed it as a community crisis and begged people to vote in favor of raising dues to cover their mounting legal expenses. But here's where karma really kicked in. By this point, most of the neighborhood hated Karen's guts thanks to all my efforts to expose her shady dealings. The meeting turned into an absolute circus, with people shouting over each other about everything from misuse of funds to unapproved mailbox designs. Yes, that came up again. One guy even stood up and said he wanted Karen removed as president altogether, which got a standing ovation from half the room. In the end, Karen didn't get her dues increase or her support rally. What she did get was an overwhelming vote of no confidence from her neighbors and a formal petition demanding her resignation as HOA president. Watching her storm out of that meeting red-faced and defeated was almost as satisfying as winning in court. But wait, it gets better. A few weeks later, after much hemming and hawing, and probably some serious soul-searching, Karen finally stepped down from her position as president. The new leadership wasted no time cutting ties with her disastrous cell tower deal and working out an agreement with me to keep things civil moving forward. As for me, well, let's just say I came out of this whole ordeal better than I ever could have imagined. But that's a story for another day. So, Karen was out, the HOA was in shambles, and I was finally starting to feel like justice had been served. But here's the thing about revenge stories, they don't always end when you think they will. Sometimes, life throws you a curveball that makes everything even sweeter. And in my case, that curveball came in the form of a very interesting phone call. It was from the telecom company, the same one that had built the tower on my land without so much as a howdy. Now, I wasn't exactly thrilled to hear from them. After all, they were just as guilty as the HOA in this whole mess. But the guy on the other end of the line sounded nervous, like he was about to ask me for a favor he knew I wouldn't want to grant. Mr. Wilson, he started. We've been informed of the court's decision regarding the cell tower on your property. Uh-huh, I said, leaning back in my chair and grinning like a cat who just caught a mouse. Well, he continued, we'd like to discuss an alternative arrangement, if you're open to it. Now, I could have told him to take his alternative arrangement and shove it where the sun don't shine, but curiosity got the better of me. Go on, I said. Turns out, removing a cell tower isn't as easy or cheap as putting one up. Who knew? The telecom company was looking at tens of thousands of dollars in removal costs, not to mention the headache of finding a new location and getting all the necessary permits. So instead of tearing it down, they wanted to know if I'd be willing to let it stay, for a price. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just a chance to get even. It was an opportunity to come out ahead, way ahead. I told them I'd think about it and hung up the phone, but let's be honest. I already knew what my answer was going to be. The next day, I called Ted and asked him to help me negotiate a new lease agreement with the telecom company. If they wanted their precious tower to stay on my land, they were going to have to pay through the nose for it. Ted worked his magic, and within a week we had a deal that made me feel like I just won the lottery. The new lease tripled, yes, tripled, the rent they'd been paying to the HOA. And instead of sending those checks to Karen and her cronies, they'd be sending them directly to me. Every month. For as long as that tower stayed standing. When I signed that contract, I couldn't help but laugh at how far things had come since this whole mess started. What began as an infuriating invasion of my property had turned into a steady stream of passive income. Enough to cover my mortgage, pay off some debts, and maybe even splurge on a new truck. Because let's face it, my old one had seen better days. But here's the best part. After cutting ties with the telecom company, the HOA didn't have enough money left in their budget to cover their legal fees or Karen's ridiculous landscaping projects. They had no choice but to lower everyone's dues. And let me tell you, that made me more popular with my neighbors than free beer at a barbecue. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with how things turned out. Karen moved out of the neighborhood shortly after resigning as HOA president. Probably because she couldn't stand seeing my smug face every time she drove past my field. And honestly, good riddance. Life's too short to deal with people who think they're above the law or basic decency. As for me, well, let's just say I've learned a few valuable lessons from this whole ordeal. Always read your HOA's governing documents before signing anything, even if they're written in Comic Sans. Never underestimate how far some people will go to avoid admitting they're wrong. And most importantly, revenge is best served with a side of financial gain. These days, I like to sit on my porch with Max, that's my dog, and watch the sun set behind my cell tower. A tower that now feels less like an eyesore and more like a monument to perseverance and pettiness. So yeah, maybe I didn't set out looking for revenge. But sometimes revenge finds you anyway. And when it does, you might as well enjoy every second of it. Alright, so there I was, sitting pretty with my newly renegotiated cell tower lease and a steady stream of rent checks rolling in. Life was good. My mortgage was covered, my debts were shrinking, and my dog Max had upgraded from generic kibble to the fancy organic stuff. But you know me, I couldn't just let things end on a peaceful note. Oh no, I had one final act of petty revenge up my sleeve, and it was going to be glorious. See, after Karen's dramatic exit from the neighborhood, the HOA was left in shambles. They were broke, disorganized, and scrambling to rebuild their reputation after months of bad press and angry neighbors. And as much as I enjoyed watching them flounder, I couldn't resist poking the bear just a little bit more. It all started with a letter. A polite but pointed letter that I sent to the new HOA president, a guy named Steve. Now, Steve wasn't nearly as insufferable as Karen had been. In fact, he seemed like a decent enough guy who just wanted to fix the mess she'd left behind. But that didn't mean I was going to let him off the hook entirely. In my letter, I thanked Steve for his efforts to lower HOA dues and improve transparency within the organization. Then I casually mentioned that I'd noticed some minor discrepancies in their financial records. Discrepancies that might require further investigation. Of course, there were no actual discrepancies, at least none that I knew of. But the mere suggestion was enough to send Steve into a panic. The next thing I knew, Steve was knocking on my door with a stack of spreadsheets and a look of pure desperation on his face. "Mr. Wilson," he said, "I assure you we're doing everything by the book now. Please let me know if there's anything else we can do to address your concerns." "Relax, Steve," I said with a grin. "I'm sure you're doing fine. Just keep an eye on those landscaping expenses. They can really add up." Steve nodded so vigorously I thought his head might fall off, then scurried back to his car like he'd just escaped a hostage situation. And while I probably should have felt bad for messing with him like that, well, let's just say guilt isn't really my thing. But wait, it gets better. A few weeks later, I decided it was time to commemorate my victory over Karen and the HOA in the most obnoxious way possible. By putting up a giant sign on my property. Not just any sign, a custom-made billboard that read, "This cell tower brought to you by Jack Wilson, defender of property rights and champion of petty revenge." Beneath the text was a cartoon drawing of me holding a gavel in one hand and a bag of money in the other. Now, some people might call this excessive or even childish, but honestly, felt like poetry. The sign quickly became the talk of the town, with neighbors stopping by to take selfies and strangers honking their horns in solidarity as they drove past. Even Max seemed to enjoy it. He'd sit by the billboard wagging his tail like he was posing for pictures too. Of course, not everyone appreciated my sense of humor. Steve called me a few days later asking if I'd consider taking down the sign because it was causing tension within the neighborhood. Tension? Please. The only tension around here was between me and Karen's leftover supporters. The same people who thought beige mailboxes were more important than basic human rights. Sorry, Steve, I said cheerfully. The sign stays. And stay it did for months. But here's where things took an unexpected turn. Instead of driving people apart, my ridiculous billboard actually brought the neighborhood closer together. It became a symbol of resistance against HOA overreach, a reminder that even ordinary folks like me could stand up to bullies and come out on top. Neighbors who'd barely spoken to each other before started bonding over shared grievances about Karen's reign of terror. People began organizing block parties and community events to celebrate our newfound freedom from her micromanaging ways. Someone even started selling t-shirts with my cartoon face on them alongside the slogan, "Jack Wilson, the hero we didn't know we needed." I'll admit, it was surreal watching myself become a local legend practically overnight. But hey, if people wanted to turn me into their mascot for anti-HOA activism, who was I to stop them? Meanwhile, life on my property continued as usual, except now it came with some added perks thanks to all those rent checks from the telecom company. I finally replaced my old truck with a shiny new one. Red? Because why not? Upgraded my porch furniture so Max could nap in style, and even splurged on a fancy espresso machine that made coffee so good it almost felt illegal. And every time I looked out at that cell tower blinking away in the distance, it wasn't an eyesore anymore. It was a reminder of everything I'd fought for and won. So yeah, maybe revenge isn't always sweet, but sometimes it's downright delicious. The cell tower saga that started with a surprise invasion of my property and escalated into a full-blown legal and petty revenge masterpiece has finally reached its conclusion. And let me tell you, it's been one heck of a ride. By now, my life had settled into a new normal. The billboard was still standing tall. My neighbors were still wearing their Jack Wilson hero t-shirts, and the rent checks from the telecom company were rolling in like clockwork. I'd even started referring to the cell tower as Wilson's Monument because, let's face it, that thing wasn't just a piece of infrastructure anymore. It was a symbol of victory. But as much as I enjoyed basking in the glow of my triumph, I couldn't help but reflect on everything this experience had taught me. For starters, I learned that HOAs are like toddlers with too much power. They'll push boundaries, break rules, and throw tantrums until someone finally tells them no. And trust me, telling them no is one of the most satisfying things you'll ever do. I also learned that standing up for yourself, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you, is always worth it. Sure, it took months of legal battles, countless headaches, and more than a few sleepless nights to get to this point. But in the end, it was all worth it just to see Karen's face when she realized she'd lost. And let's not forget the importance of having a good lawyer. Ted might have looked like he hadn't slept since the Clinton administration, but that man was an absolute genius when it came to property law. If you're ever in a bind with your HOA, or anyone else trying to mess with your rights, do yourself a favor and hire someone like Ted. You won't regret it. Now, before we wrap this up, I want to leave you with a little advice for dealing with your own HOA, because let's be real. If you live in a neighborhood with an HOA, it's only a matter of time before they come knocking on your door about something ridiculous. First and foremost, know your rights. Read your HOA's governing documents. Yes, even if they're written in Comic Sans, and make sure you understand what they can and can't do. Trust me, there's nothing more empowering than being able to throw their own rules back in their faces when they try to overstep. Second, document everything. Keep copies of every letter, email, and notice you receive from your HOA. Take pictures of your property before and after any disputes arise. And if things escalate to the point where you need legal help, having all that evidence will make your lawyer's job so much easier. Third, don't be afraid to push back. HOAs rely on people being too intimidated or apathetic to challenge them. But if enough homeowners stand up and say enough is enough, they'll have no choice but to back down. And finally, Never underestimate the power of humor and pettiness. Sure, it might not solve all your problems, but it'll make the journey a whole lot more entertaining. So there you have it, the story of how one man took on an overreaching HOA, won his case, and turned a cell tower into a cash cow. It's been an incredible journey filled with twists, turns, and more than a few laughs along the way. And if there's one thing I hope you take away from all this, besides maybe some tips for dealing with your own HOA, it's that sometimes life throws you challenges not just to test you, but to give you opportunities for growth, and maybe even revenge. Now before I go, let me ask you for one tiny favor. If you enjoyed this story, and let's be honest, how could you not? Please hit that like button below. Share this video with your friends who've had their own HOA horror Aries, because we all know at least one person who has. Leave a comment telling me about your experience with HOAs. I'd love to hear how you've dealt with them or what petty revenge stories you might have up your sleeve. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories like this one. Because trust me, folks, I've got plenty more where this came from. Thanks for watching, and remember, when life gives you lemons, turn them into rent checks. See y'all next time.